The wind rolled in from the east, kicking up dust that clung to the wooden storefronts and crept between the cracks in old boots. Silas Reed shifted in his saddle as his horse came to a slow stop at the edge of town. He sat still for a moment, squinting beneath the wide brim of his hat at the dry little main street laid out ahead. The town had no name worth remembering, just another tired patch of sun-bleached wood and brittle grass in the Oregon Territory, where people came to disappear or die quietly. A bell clanged in the distance, marking noon. No one paid it much mind. Time here moved on the back of hunger, not clocks. Silas dismounted with the slow care of a man whose body remembered every mile he'd traveled. Dust flaked from his duster as his boots hit the ground. He tied off his horse near the blacksmith's post and reached for his canteen, taking a long, silent drink. Then he just stood there, not looking at anything in particular, not expecting much. He hadn't spoken in 2 days, and he had no plans to start now. "Sir?" The voice was so soft it nearly vanished in the wind. Silas turned slowly. At first, he saw no one. Then his eyes dropped and found her, small and squarely planted in the dirt. A girl, maybe 6 or 7, with a mess of straw blonde curls tangled beneath a crooked bonnet. Her dress was a shade too thin for the chill in the wind, and her boots were scuffed raw. She looked up at him, chin trembling but eyes steady. "My papa died," she said. Silas blinked, said nothing. She took a step closer, holding something in both hands, a small woven basket with a handful of limp daisies. "But today's my mama's anniversary," she whispered, "and I thought maybe, would you come with me?" He looked around, no one else in sight. The blacksmith was gone. The general store door flapped in the breeze but stayed empty. A dog barked somewhere far off. It was just him and this little girl standing in the middle of a street that had no business witnessing something this tender. Silas glanced at the basket, then at her eyes. He gave a slow, solemn nod. They walked in silence side by side. Her tiny steps kept time with his long stride, as though she'd practiced walking beside ghosts. He didn't ask where they were going. She didn't say. They passed the old church, roof caved in on one side, and a laundry line strung with tattered linens. The outskirts came quick. The road narrowed and the grass grew wild around the fence posts. Up ahead stood a weather-beaten farmhouse, half slumped against the horizon. A chicken coop leaned on one leg, and a rusted bucket rolled lazily in the wind. She stopped at the gate. He did too. "She don't like visitors," the girl said quietly. "Then why bring me?" The girl didn't answer. She opened the gate. The porch creaked under their weight. The door stood ajar, shadows pooling inside like spilled ink. The girl walked in, her steps light but practiced. Silas followed. Inside, the air was still, heavy with the smell of dust, old wood, and something cooked too long on the stove. A woman stood at the sink, her back rigid, long hair pinned in a twist, shoulders tense. She didn't turn when the door opened. "Rosie?" she asked. "I brought someone," the girl said. Now the woman turned. Her eyes locked on Silas. Gray eyes, not the soft kind. Cold water in winter. Her face was beautiful, but not in any way a man would mention out loud. There was too much grief carved into it, around her mouth, in the hollow under her cheekbones. Her hands wiped on her apron, slow and dry. She didn't ask his name, didn't offer hers. "I don't recall inviting anyone. He just came with me," Rosie said. The woman looked at the daisies in the girl's hand. For a moment the lines around her mouth softened. Silas stayed where he was, hat in hand. "I'll go," he said, voice low and even. "No," Rosie said. "Stay, just for supper." Evelyn, that was her name, though she hadn't given it, looked between them for a long breath. Then she turned back to the stove. Supper was thin stew and hard bread. Silas ate slowly, every bite echoing in the silence. Rosie chatted softly about the chickens and how her papa used to sing to them. Evelyn kept her eyes on her bowl, nodding sometimes but not speaking. When the meal ended, Rosie gathered up the dishes with a careful reverence, setting the basket of daisies in the middle of the table like a centerpiece. Silas stood, ready to leave. "Thank you," he said. Evelyn gave a curt nod. "It was kind of you." He hesitated at the door. Rosie had stopped moving. She was watching him like she might never see him again. "A girl like that shouldn't carry so much alone," he said quietly. Evelyn's shoulders stiffened, but she said nothing. Outside the wind had picked up. Silas mounted his horse, looking once more at the house, at the flicker of movement in the window. Then he rode off into the dusk. That night, sleep came slow. The fire in his camp sputtered as he stared into it, replaying her words. He just came with me. As if that was all it took. Thunder rumbled sometime after midnight. The rain came fast, cold and punishing. Silas pulled his coat tighter and dozed in fits, never quite letting go. The hoofbeats woke him. He sat up fast, hand to his pistol. Then he saw her. Rosie, soaked to the bone, mud up to her knees, gripping the reins of a mule that looked half dead. "She's gone," Rosie gasped, teeth chattering. "Mama's gone. She took the rifle and left before dawn, said not to follow, but she's not right, mister. Something's wrong." Silas didn't ask any more questions. He lifted her from the saddle, wrapped her in his coat, and set her by the fire. She clung to him without a word, eyes wide and empty. The storm pounded the earth as he built the flames. Higher. In the orange light he saw the panic settle into something older, familiar. This wasn't the first time the girl had been left behind, just the worst. Silas sat beside her, rubbing her hands to warm them. She looked up at him, face pale and round. She didn't say goodbye. He looked away. "Most folks don't," he said. By morning the storm had passed. The world looked rinsed, clean and raw. Silas saddled his horse, bundled Rosie behind him, and began to ride. No destination, only a direction. Toward the foothills where the land turned wild and the trees swallowed paths whole. They tracked faint boot prints, broken branches, scraps of fabric caught on bramble. Evelyn had gone where people didn't come back from. Whether by accident or intent, he didn't know. Rosie spoke little. She held tight to his back, her head resting against him. Every so often she'd say, "Do you think she's okay?" He never answered. They camped near the ridge that night, in the cradle of two boulders that shielded them from the wind. Silas gave Rosie the last of his jerky, then covered her with his bedroll. She slept curled in a tight ball. In the dark, Silas stared at the stars. He remembered another night like this, long ago, when he'd held a smaller hand and whispered promises he couldn't keep. That hand had gone cold by dawn. He didn't sleep. At first light, they found a ribbon, caught in a branch, fluttering in the breeze, pale blue, frayed at the end. Rosie gasped, "It's hers." They were close. The mountains loomed ahead. The trail turned rougher, less forgiving. Silas's horse began to falter on the incline. Rosie slid off and walked beside him, never complaining. Later they found the empty cartridge, then the torn bit of cloth, stained red. Evelyn had fired at something, or someone. Silas knelt to inspect it. His fingers traced the dried blood, still warm, maybe a day old. He looked at the tracks. They weren't alone in these woods. He straightened, scanning the trees. Rosie tugged his coat. "You'll find her," she said, with a calm that shook him more than any scream would have. He nodded, though he wasn't sure. Not yet. They moved deeper into the trees, their shapes swallowed by shadow and silence. Somewhere ahead, a mother grieved and bled, and somewhere behind them, the past whispered through the pines, relentless and unforgiving. Silas Reed rode on, the child pressed against him, the sky darkening once more. And the silence now. It had weight. The mule trudged along the narrowing trail, hooves slipping now and then on half-frozen mud. Silas kept one hand on the reins and the other steadying Rosie, who sat wrapped in his coat, her cheek pressed to his back. The early light filtered through skeletal pine branches, pale and shivering, the scent of wet bark rising after the storm. Everything smelled of earth and endings. The girl hadn't said a word since they left camp. She didn't need to. Her silence said more than any child should know how to say. They had followed Evelyn's trail for hours, through brush that scraped Silas's arms and across streams swollen with yesterday's rain. The bootprints were spaced unevenly. At times, it looked as though she had run. Other times, like she was dragging her own weight forward with force of will alone. Twice, Silas found small blood smears on stones. Neither fresh nor fatal, but enough to keep him pressing onward with a grim set to his jaw. He didn't know what Evelyn meant to do, but grief was a trickster. It could whisper one thing and drive a body to another. He had seen it before, in men who sat too long with old letters or women who sang lullabies to no one. And in himself, when the silence of his own cabin had grown unbearable enough to send him into the wild with nothing but regret for company. Rosie's fingers tightened around his sides as the mule jolted over a root. She hadn't complained once. Her face, it was pale, lips chapped, but her eyes were alert, watching everything, watching for her mother. "She's scared of being weak," Rosie said suddenly. Her voice was small and hoarse, as if it had cracked open from the inside. Silas turned his head slightly. "What makes you think that?" "She cried once, thought I was asleep. She kept saying, 'I can't be like this, I can't let her see.'" Rosie hesitated. "I didn't say anything, but I remember." He nodded. "Not to her, not really, more to the thought. She's out here because she doesn't want to be found," he said. "But you're finding her anyway." Silas didn't answer. He just clicked his tongue and urged the mule on. By mid-morning, the trees opened into a clearing. It was a place that had once been a hunter's camp. Burnt logs circled in the ashes of old fire. A rusty tin cup sat half buried in mud. Silas dismounted and helped Rosie down. She looked stiff, knees wobbling from the cold and the long ride, but she stood firm. He scouted the perimeter, eyes scanning for anything out of place. That's when he saw it. Just beyond the clearing, the brush had been disturbed. Broken branches, a bent sapling, and a shredded piece of blue ribbon caught on a thorn. "She came through here," he muttered. "She still has the ribbon," Rosie said, stepping beside him. Silas looked at her. "You're certain?" "She used to say blue makes her feel like she could breathe." They crossed into the undergrowth, pushing through low limbs and tangles. After another quarter-mile, Silas found it, a deep footprint beside a patch of red-streaked moss. It wasn't Evelyn's blood. The boot print beside it was too large, the gait too aggressive. Someone had been following her. He crouched, fingertips brushing the dirt. There were 3 distinct sets now. Evelyn's, uneven and hurried. One male, heavy-set, boots worn at the heel. The third, barefoot, lighter. Rosie waited behind him, her small face furrowed in concern. Silas rose and turned them around, heading back to the clearing. It wasn't safe to track forward without knowing who else was involved. He needed clarity, fire, a map in the dirt, if nothing else. They returned to the makeshift camp and settled near the remains of the fire pit. Silas struck flint and steel until the spark caught and flame licked up from the damp kindling. Rosie huddled close, hands outstretched, and said nothing. The wind shifted around midday, and with it came footsteps. Soft, deliberate. Silas was already standing, rifle in hand, when the figure appeared between the trees. He was tall and weathered, skin sun-darkened, braided hair over one shoulder, a woven tunic beneath a blanket of fur. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes missed nothing. Rosie looked up. Her voice came out barely audible. "Is he bad?" Silas didn't lower the rifle, but he didn't fire either. The man lifted one hand, palm out. Not surrender, respect. He stepped into the light of the fire and spoke in a quiet, even tone. "I saw her, woman with blood on her hand, walking toward the hollow." Silas narrowed his eyes. "You followed her?" "I watched. The land talks when people don't. She cried for something she couldn't bury." The man looked at Rosie. "You her child?" Rosie nodded slowly. The man crouched near the fire, unbothered by Silas's caution. He reached into his pack and pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside, roots, dried herbs, a strip of bark. "She is wounded in her spirit," he said, unwrapping one root, "and maybe her body." "Who are you?" Silas asked, lowering the rifle slightly. "Toma," he said. "From the Wallowa side. I live quiet. The land is my family." Rosie shifted closer to Silas, but she kept her eyes on Toma. There was no fear in her face now, just curiosity. Silas considered the man. He didn't trust easily, but Toma's presence felt different than the danger he'd smelled in the trail. There was no greed in his posture, no hunger, just knowing. "What did you see exactly?" Silas asked. Toma pulled a piece of charcoal from his pouch and drew in the dirt. A ridge, a winding path, a circle. Then 3 marks. "She camped here. 2 men came. One left bleeding, the other still follows." Silas knelt beside him. "And she?" "She ran, south, toward the river bend. It's treacherous, cliffside, cold." Rosie hugged herself tighter. "We have to go," she said. Toma looked at Silas. "The child should not walk that road. She doesn't leave my side." They packed quickly. Toma led the way, his steps light and confident. Rosie rode with Silas again, both watching the back of this quiet stranger who seemed to read the forest like scripture. As dusk approached, snow began to fall. Not a storm, but a slow, steady drift, soft flakes settling on hats, lashes, shoulders. The temperature dropped sharply. Toma signaled for a stop when the trees thinned along a slope, revealing the faint outline of the river far below. "We sleep here," he said. "Fire below the wind. Dawn will show her tracks." They made camp under a stone outcropping. Toma prepared the roots, brewing a bitter tea that he insisted Rosie drink. She wrinkled her nose, but obeyed. "Tell me about her," Silas asked quietly once Rosie had curled up in the blankets. Toma didn't speak for a while. When he did, his voice was hushed. She moved like prey, always listening, as if hunted by a shadow that never left her heels. She watched the wind as if it might speak her name. Her eyes were open, but her soul was curled tight. Silas looked into the fire, thinking of the night Evelyn had stood at the sink and barely acknowledged his presence. The tension in her back, the way her daughter whispered through the weight. "I think she wanted to disappear," Silas said. "She wanted to be free," Toma replied. "But forgetting is no the same." In the morning, they woke early. The snow had stopped, leaving a crisp glaze over the world. Tracks were easier to read. Toma pointed out the fresh prints veering dangerously close to the cliff edge. "She's tiring," he said, "and someone else is closing in." They picked up speed. The terrain grew mean, rocks slick with ice, slopes threatening to drop into the canyon below. Rosie stayed quiet, alert, clutching Silas tightly. At one bend, they saw the first sign of struggle, a broken rifle strap, a torn piece of cloth snagged on a low branch. Then, up ahead, a smear of red on a stone. Silas dismounted and knelt again, still warm, not enough to be fatal, but she was close, and hurt. Rosie slid off the mule, her boots crunching in the frost. She didn't ask questions this time. They crested a ridge and paused. There, below them, Evelyn stood near the cliff's edge, her clothes torn, face streaked with dirt, hands trembling around the stock of a rifle. She turned slowly as they approached, her eyes wild, unfocused. "Don't come any closer," she shouted, voice cracking. Toma raised a hand, saying nothing. Silas stepped forward slowly. "Evelyn," he said, "it's us." Her hands shook more violently. "I didn't want this. I didn't want to be found." "You're not alone," he said. She backed closer to the edge. Rosie broke free and ran. "Rosie!" Silas called, reaching too late. But the girl didn't stop. She ran straight into her mother's arms, wrapped around her waist, clinging with the kind of desperation that only children understand. Evelyn collapsed to her knees, dropping the rifle. She sobbed without sound as Rosie held her. Silas stepped forward, picking up the rifle. Toma remained at the ridge, silent and watchful. The wind howled across the canyon. Evelyn buried her face in her daughter's hair and whispered something no one else could hear. Silas turned his gaze toward the horizon, and for the first time in days, he let his shoulders drop, not in surrender, in release. The silence wasn't gone, but now it had room to breathe. The snow had melted into a stubborn crust of ice by the time they made it back to the valley floor. The wind was gentler now, brushing the grass with a softer hand, as though the land itself had taken a breath. Evelyn walked slowly, still pale, but no longer leaning on Silas for support. Rosie held her mother's hand like she might let go and vanish again if she blinked. Every few steps, Evelyn would glance down and squeeze the girl's fingers like she was reminding herself this wasn't a dream or a ghost come to scold her. They returned to the farmhouse by dusk. The porch still sagged, the windows still bore the smudge of storms and dust, but something about it felt less hollow. Inside, the hearth waited cold. Silas set to work, stacking wood with the same quiet rhythm he had carried through every mile. Evelyn moved with hesitation, as if unsure of her place even in her own home. Rosie darted around, lighting candles and humming half-forgotten tunes under her breath, too young to know what healing looked like, but wise enough to help it start. Toma stayed only until morning. He left without ceremony, slipping away into the trees before the sun rose. Silas watched him go from the hilltop, a shadow disappearing into the forest. No words had passed between them at the end. None were needed. Toma had given what was needed: guidance, presence, a hand steady in silence. Days passed in slow, careful rhythms. Silas stayed. At first, he made excuses, repairs to the stable, chopping wood, checking traps. Evelyn didn't ask him to go. She didn't ask him anything, but each day she lingered longer when they spoke. Each night, she stood a little closer to the fire when he was there. She had changed. Not completely. Grief still clung to her like the smell of rain-soaked wood, but her eyes no longer scanned the horizon like something was coming for her. She no longer flinched when Rosie laughed too loud, and once, when Silas walked into the room without warning, she didn't hide her tears. She just wiped them with the back of her hand and offered him a chair. Rosie was the only one who moved freely between them, binding their days with small invisible threads. She would crawl into Silas's lap during the cold evenings, listening to the fire crackle while he carved little horses from scrap wood. She'd braid wildflowers into her mother's hair and then try to do the same for Silas, laughing when his hat got in the way. And slowly, what had once been a hollow house began to echo with life again. Not loud, not sudden, but present. One night, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold. She stared into it like it held a map of everything she'd lost. "I couldn't protect him," she said. Silas looked up from the stove. "I told him not to ride into town that day. Told him I had a bad feeling. But he went anyway. Thought he could handle himself. Thought we were safe. The war was over after all. What did we have to fear?" She laughed then, hollow and bitter. "It wasn't a soldier who killed him, just a man who wanted something and didn't care who stood in his way." Silas didn't offer comfort, not because he didn't have any, but because the words would have rung false. Instead, he sat down across from her and waited. "I stayed angry for so long," she whispered. "At him, at myself, at God, at Rosie." Her voice cracked. "I hated that I couldn't be strong for her. I hated that every time I looked at her, I saw him. I thought leaving would protect her. I thought, if I disappeared, the pain would follow me." "It never does," Silas said. "No," she replied. "It just follows quieter." Silas leaned back, fingers curling around the rim of his cup. The firelight made shadows dance across his face, softening the lines carved by time and solitude. "I lost a daughter," he said after a long silence. "Winter storm took her. We were trasseurs, apt in a pass. I thought I could beat the blizzard, thought I was clever, but clever men die the same as fools out there." Evelyn met his gaze, her mouth opened, but no words came. "She was 6, Silas continued. "Brown curls. Asked too many questions. I buried her beneath a tree wrapped in my coat." The silence between them stretched, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was shared. "You still carry her," Evelyn said. "I carry the quiet," he replied. The next morning, Silas found Rosie sitting on the porch with a daisy chain in her lap. She looked up, grinning. "Did you know Mama used to wear daisies in her hair?" "No," he said, "but it suits her." Rosie nodded solemnly. "She smiled today when I gave her one. Not a pretend smile, a real one. She's getting stronger." "She's warmer," Rosie said, leaning against his arm. "You're warmer too." That spring, Evelyn planted a garden. It began with one patch, parsley and onions, some wild potatoes Silas helped dig from the creek bed. Then came beans, squash, and tomatoes. She worked with her sleeves rolled and her hair loose. Rosie trailed behind with a watering pail too big for her, sloshing more onto her dress than the soil. Silas built a new fence, mended the roof, tamed the mule even. He slept in the barn at first, but then a cot appeared in the storage room. No one spoke about it. One day he simply started sleeping inside, and the earth didn't split for it. Evenings became quieter in a new way, not hollow, not lonely, just gentle. Rosie took to collecting stones from the creek, lining them up on the porch rail, declaring each one held a secret if you listened right. Evelyn laughed more. Sometimes she sat beside Silas with their arms brushing and neither of them moved away. Once she touched his hand when she thought he wasn't paying attention. He didn't pull back. One evening, a storm swept through. The five rest since their return from the mountains. Thunder rattled the windows, and Rosie woke crying. Evelyn rushed in, wrapped her in a quilt, and carried her to the fire. Silas stoked the flames higher, and the three of them sat there until morning. Evelyn never let go of Rosie, and Rosie never let go of Silas's sleeve. The next week, Silas went to town for supplies. He returned with a bolt of blue ribbon and a carved wooden locket. He left them on the kitchen table without a word. That evening, Evelyn tied her hair back with the ribbon. She wore the locket beneath her blouse. Neither of them spoke of it. It wasn't love the way the stories told it. Not fast, not fiery, not certain. It was quieter, earned. It was Evelyn's voice when she asked Silas to stay for supper and didn't pretend it was just for Rosie. It was the way Silas started saying we instead of you. It was Rosie drawing 3 stick figures in the dirt and calling them a family without hesitation. That summer, on a day bright with prairie wind, Evelyn walked into the yard in a dress Rosie had patched herself. Her hair was up, her face open. Silas stood beside her, clean shirt, hands folded awkwardly. Rosie stood between them with a handful of daisies, trying to keep them from wilting. There were no vows, no preacher, no guests, just them, and the land, and the wind. Rosie held the daisies high and declared them married. Evelyn laughed, then cried. Silas placed a hand on her cheek and she leaned into it like she'd known that hand all her life. Later that night, after the sun had bled out into the horizon, Silas took Rosie for a walk. They stopped beneath the old cottonwood at the edge of the field. He knelt and placed a single daisy at its base. "This is for her," he said. "For your daughter?" Rosie asked. He nodded. "She would have liked me," Rosie said, grinning. Silas smiled. "I think she would have followed you everywhere." Rosie sat beside him in the grass, legs crossed. The stars blinked alive overhead, quiet and steady. "You think love ever gets lost, Shah?" he asked. He looked up, following the lines of starlight. "No," he said. "I think sometimes it just forgets the way." They stayed there a while, not speaking, just breathing in the calm. Behind them, the windows of the farmhouse glowed with candlelight, warm and steady. Evelyn stood inside, watching, one hand on her locket, the blue ribbon trailing down her back like a flag of peace. Love hadn't returned with noise. It had come gently, like the wind over a broken field, like a daisy growing in hard soil, and somehow that made it all the stronger.